have a bit of a deep dive into the data tidy up process. So yeah, just a few introductions. You met Ian. Ian's going to be working in the chat tonight, and also then picking up some of your questions that are coming in through that process, along with Matt Holden from our technology team and myself, Alex Bowden, who works in our rugby development team. And I'm also pleased to say we've got Chloe Burgess joining us. Chloe's going to be in the chat function tonight. So as your questions come in, if there's questions that can be covered off straight away, Chloe will pick those up. And if it's something that we're not going to answer as we go through, then Ian will pull those out, and between Matt and I will be able to cover those off. So just a bit of a starter tonight in terms of what we're going to cover. So our key intent is to provide you with an overview of why the data tidy up is taking place. But most importantly, following on from some previous sessions already delivered, is to answer your questions relating to the data tidy up process. And looking at the questions which have come in already, and thank you very much to everybody who's submitted some. We've had some brilliant questions come in from everybody so far. There are a number of questions which are data tidy related, but we've also got a few that are related to other areas of GMS. So just to sort of stress tonight, we are going to work through those ones that are data tidy related, and as we follow up, we will come back to you with any information we may need that we can't answer tonight, or maybe picked up in other areas of GMS that you may need support on. And we'll also cover at the end the sort of support mechanisms that are in place to help you with some of them. But our aim is to cover as many questions as we can, and we'll work through those as we go through. As I say, we've had lots of questions in already, so what we've done is we've put them into themes so we can try and work through and cover them. So hang fire on putting too many questions in the chat so far. We'll work through those themes first with those questions from the people that have submitted, and then if the question's not covered, I'll give you a shout, and you can start to type away if there's anything we've not covered. But please feel free to use that chat function with anything that may come up. So in terms of the sort of themes we've worked through, one of the first bits in terms of the why. So we're going to kick off with a poll, and I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's just going to ask you this poll to get us started.
Cheers, Alex. So I'm just going to launch that first poll now. You'll see the question on your screen, and that poll should be on your screen now. So do you understand why the data tidy is taking place? Yes or no? Get those votes coming in. Brilliant to see so many of you in attendance tonight. A great turnout. I'll leave it a few more seconds so everyone can get that vote in. Just the last few to vote now. If you haven't voted, get your vote in now. And I'm going to end the polling there, and I'm going to share the results with everybody. And you'll see there. Over to you, Alex. A good mix.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, as you said, good mix there. So I think hopefully positively got a good sort of 64% that understand why it's being done. So hopefully as we work through tonight, the questions will be very much related to supporting you with doing that process. And then a group of you who sort of don't fully understand why it's taking place, and what we really want to do with that as we work through the questions is hopefully give you some further understanding of why it's taking place, and support with how it's done, and also any questions you might have with regards to that. So thank you very much for taking part in that first poll. So in terms of why we're doing it, so this is part of a long-term project around having accurate data and better engaging with all levels of the game, all people that play the game, and building on the sort of age grade changes over the last 3 years. So the identification really came from the challenges that the only mandatory side of registration and people on GMS related to adult players, male players, which is up to a maximum 100 players, and all female players that register, but there was no requirement in there to deregister. And age grade, as a number of you on the call I'm sure will know, has changed over the last 3 years and changed the process. So there is a player affiliation, player registration process for age grade players, which requires that to be redone each season. So the policies have sort of always been there, and because of that, we have sort of some legacy processes that mean it is a very club admin heavy process. There's been no validation of the credentials from the individual. As we all know, with some of the challenges we may have had in the past around logging in and having duplicate data does become out of date, and that causes us challenges and problems. And in a lot of cases, many individuals are unaware they even have an account or that they actually exist on GMS. So the process aims to try and work through that, avoid those duplications and errors because they're commonplace. And just in terms of the sort of the scale of the challenge we're trying to work through this, 2.1 million records in GMS, 1.4 of those have never logged in, and 1 million of them there isn't an email address. So it's something we want to try and work through, want to try and address to improve that, and to try and help that process in both clubs and players. So the aspiration as part of this, as I say, it's part of a longer term project and process that we're trying to work towards, following in the success really of the age grade process, which has been significant sort of trial and error and working through with live user groups from clubs and players, is to try and replicate that across the senior game. So looking at a player affiliation process for senior players, and looking at all adult players would still register them to their league through the registration portal and through club administrators. But the key aspect of this would be that individuals create and own their own account. So they know their account exists at the moment, not a number of them don't know that. And to have a revalidation process, as we do with the age grade now, with the club administrator validating that rather than inputting all the data and managing being responsible for that. So that's the aspiration we're working towards, and the player affiliation process will be piloted. It will be worked on with a number of pilot constituent bodies and clubs as part of the user group process, like the age grade process has. But in order to do that, we need the data tidy to take place first, to start to clear out some of those records which aren't valid and are inaccurate, to give us more accurate and usable data. So that's the sort of purpose and the aim of what we're wanting to change. So again, I'm going to hand over to Ian just to do a little bit of a poll before we go into that in a little bit more detail.
Cheers, Alex. Just going to launch that poll number 2 for you guys now. So should clubs CBs, so constituent bodies, and the RFU communicate with players more often? Yes, no, or you think it's about right how we've got it now? Appreciate over the last few months there has been a lot of communication around various things, so keep those votes coming in. Thank you very much. Just a few more. We have got 107 people currently participating and viewing this question, for those that are asking on the last one, and just waiting for a last few people to get their votes in, and I'm going to end the poll there. So thank you for voting if you voted. I'm going to share those results with you now.
Thanks, Ian. So yeah, 44% saying yes, we should communicate with more often, whether that be a club, a constituent body, or the RFU, and 25% no, and 31% about right. So it's quite an even split there, but I think even in terms of that, 44% saying yes more often, that's one of the big bits we want to try and address within this process, and the data tidy is the first step of that, the first stage. So we're looking at how do we do that? How do we communicate with players more often? So from a player's point of view, a number of sort of research surveys have been done, work with other governing bodies, other sports and other sort of industries, and players want communication more regularly and directly. At the moment, through the figures you've just seen there on GMS, that's not possible outside of how clubs may do it individually, but from a constituent body or RFU perspective, it doesn't give us the ability to do that because of inaccurate information. And also there's the feeling that in a lot of sports, and the player who may go to the gym or go play cricket in terms of last man stands, they like the individual personalised communication. So it may have some stats on there about what they've done, but it may also be about player welfare and specific communication. So we need to look at how we can do that. Using things like electronic match cards to share and enhance the player enjoyment is something we want to try and trial over the course of the player affiliation pilots. In terms of volunteers and clubs, the aim is to reduce the burden on the communication that falls to too few volunteers, and a number of questions are coming in around that. It's a large task now, however, something we're looking at is we want to reduce that. So everything for a player shouldn't come through the club administration team. It should come directly to the player, and that they know they own that record. So very much sort of data-led club management, and hopefully that will support decision-making processes. And then in terms of the RFU and the constituent bodies, so whichever county you fall within, it would allow us to actually communicate more and more effectively with them and improve the player journey. So again, being able to understand what players want more rather than asking clubs to ask the players, which we know a lot of clubs do really well, but so that we can gather that information and look how we can support with that. And overall, the aim of that is to support retention, having greater retention across all the games. And the feedback from the age grade process has allowed us to start to pick up some great stuff from that. So just a quick recap on what it is. So it's it aims to clear up unusable, so incorrect or incomplete data and records on GMS. It will run till the 23rd of July. The window's open now, and we know a lot of clubs are already engaged with that. And at the moment, in terms of who can access that, it's the club administrators with access to the people module. And then following that, we'll be then archiving those records which don't meet management standards or don't meet some of the certain rules that we've put in place, which we'll talk through tonight to make sure that we don't lose records which you're actively using. And just to kick off as an example, one of the questions that came in terms of this came in from John Strickland in terms of how do we access the sort of grid view. You'll see on the right hand side there the numbers against, so there's 53 records in this example that don't have a name on there. So by clicking on that 53, you can then get the grid view to actually see who those people are. Although without the name, you may struggle, but the gender, the date of birth, and the other details will be there. So we'll work through that in a little bit more detail tonight. And just a reminder of the minimum data standards. So first name, last name, date of birth, home postcode, gender, and email address. And the email address is for those adult records. And again, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail on the questions that have come in. So just to recap the why, allow everybody to have a better understanding of the player base, so the players that are playing rugby union and in our clubs and across the country to support what we're trying to do. Support player retention, and in terms of this window, the return to rugby in September, and allow us to see what the state of the game is following the COVID pandemic. It'll build on a line to the changes that have been implemented in the age grade game, which have been significant over the last 3 years, and I've tested a number of the parts of this process. Overall, we want to improve that data quality and the accuracy, reduce that 1.4 million records that have never been logged in, and ultimately move towards a player-owned records, so they're responsible for their own record. And the other part of this is it starts to allow us to prepare for improved systems to help manage player welfare. So a number of you have seen changes that are coming in that area, and GMS can play a significant role in helping you with that. But without the accurate data, it's something that can't be achieved. So we're gonna move on to the questions received now. And firstly, thank you to everyone who has sent them in, and we'll work through these. So hopefully you'll see your questions. Some of them have been amalgamated, so 2 or 3 very similar questions. But as we go through, hopefully we'll cover off what you've looked at. And we've themed these. So the first one we've looked at is archiving. So a number of questions came in on this. And thank you to, so we've had one from, again, John Strickland on electronic match cards, Neil Whittington from Cobham, around what do we actually mean by archiving. So those questions are up here, and some of the other ones from others in the room, hopefully. So in terms of what we mean by archiving, in August, at the beginning of August, once the data tidy up window is closed, we will work through and we will go through a process of archiving those records, so they will be removed from the club-facing platform and be archived by the RFU. And in a second, I'll bring in Matt just to add a little bit more detail to that in terms of what that means and why we're doing it. And to sort of keep it with this is we need to remove those records so that we get a much more accurate picture of who's there, and those people that are in there can be communicated with. So Matt, I'll just bring you in terms of those first couple of questions at the top, if you're okay, just to add a little bit of context to those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Just for some additional context to what's taking place at the moment, as Alex has touched on, what we're trying to do here is make sure that we provide clubs with a better view of who's actually active at their organisation, and some of the key things that we receive into the service desk, and then the wider feedback really stems from poor quality data that exists in GMS, and then provides us with lots of challenge. So as Alex has already touched on, there's some of those legacy processes that we're really trying to address, and then create a process where we encourage that data to be of a certain standard. So What do we mean by archive? Effectively, that's taking records out that we see as unusable for clubs and for CBs and for the RFU. So if if an individual can't be contacted, if that record doesn't have a minimum set of data, then we'd be looking to take that out of GMS and archive that, and keeping those records that are in GMS as in a usable state. And we want to encourage the fact that we're doing the bulk of removing of those records on clubs' behalf, where we've been presented with the fact that that's been a barrier to usage in the past. So the RFU will keep effectively that archive record in an archive database, and we'd be looking to just look at those records in the past of any that have had any particular status, to say have a view on how many records existed at that particular time, but certainly to take those out of the live environment where they're not usable, which is why we've put that criteria around, and we'll clarify some more of the points on that as we move forward, and why we're encouraging that some records are kept and others are removed.
Thanks, Matt. That's brilliant. So hopefully that starts to talk a bit of context of what the archiving process is for the questions that have come in and some of the questions that may be in the chat so far. We've also sort of really want to stress this has been a live process. We've engaged with a number of clubs, and thank you to those on the call who have done that to help come up with some rules that we've needed to put in place to make sure that some of the records which may not meet the minimum standard but are very much active and clubs are engaged with and would potentially impact on the start of rugby in September. We put some rules in place to make sure that doesn't happen, and we can work through as the process develops how we deal with those in the future. But a couple of questions that specifically to that was, how would this affect my effectively registered players? So male first team players who may be registered to play in the leagues, female players that are registered to play in the leagues. So what we've put in place with here is any club any player who's appeared in an electronic match card at any point will not be archived. So they will remain in the system. What we really want to do there is encourage clubs to start to update those. Remembering that the minimum standard has been in place now for 3 years, so any new record that's been created in that time will meet these standards anyway. So some of these may be historical ones that have been there a long time. The electronic match card system hasn't been in place too long either, so the decision was taken to consider any player who's appeared on there will remain on the system and not be archived. So that shouldn't affect any registered players for the start of this season. That also applies to any existing and current DBS, individual with a current DBS. So again, those that are using GMS will see where it's logged as the individual having a DBS. So they will not be archived either. So even if they don't meet the standards, that will remain in there, so that doesn't affect our coaches or our individuals working with age-grade players. So the archiving process, as we've gone through, has allowed us to sort of evolve that and address some of the questions that have come in to make sure that we're able to keep the people that are active in the clubs active that may not quite meet all the standards, but we would encourage you to work within that and update those where possible as we work through the next 12 months through to next summer. So archive, in terms of the archiving process, that sort of picked up the key question that came in advance. The other big one that came in is around active members, and a number of clubs are using the membership category in the membership process within GMS, and it was important that we don't penalise those clubs that are using that, because the member on there may be a non-player member, for instance, and not have all the relevant minimum standards in there. So in terms of what we consider the active member, it is a club who are using the membership process within GMS. And a decision sort of been made with that if there are missing fields, but that individual has a record that they have been logged as an active member at the club since August 2019. So for the last 2 seasons, which takes into account for the COVID impacted season last year, when a club may not have kept this up to date, or a member may not have renewed. It takes in the previous 19-20 season. They will also not be archived. So if you are using that category, and we know there's quite a large number of clubs that are using the membership functionality on there, which is brilliant, then you won't have those players or non-playing members archived in there. So that sort of covers covers off a key aspect of that. And again, I'm going to bring in Matt just to talk through the impact to a coach who may have been archived, and a question around whether their records will be lost, and also whether a club can then access somebody who has already been archived. So Matt, I'll hand over first.
Thanks, Alex. I think what we're really trying to reiterate is that we don't want collectively to make this a big problem for clubs. We're trying to get on the front foot with removing records so that we create a process that's far more user-friendly for both a player or a volunteer or a coach or a member to log in and manage their own information. And where it's proving extremely difficult at the moment is where that information exists on GMS and an individual doesn't necessarily know they exist on GMS. That's where we see a potential barrier for usage. So if an individual then would like to go and log into GMS and they don't have an email address against their account that has been verified, that account recovery process then becomes quite tricky because it's based upon the email address and the uniqueness of that email address when that individual goes to try and recover their account. So what we'd like to reiterate here is that if an individual wants to create a new account, we see that as a simple process that takes 30 seconds. And that's by visiting GMS, creating that account, and then choosing the club that that individual wishes to be associated with. Now, if that individual doesn't then know that they exist on GMS, it's very difficult to then sort of justify why that record should be retained. Obviously, clubs have particular processes whereby they like to interact with those individuals, but we would stress that that individual should know that they actually exist on that system and then be able to update their details should they wish. So when we sort of talk about active members, as Alex has already touched on, we can see that active membership actually could be impacted by COVID. And we've got around sort of 350 clubs that have utilised membership in some way, shape or form. And we see that obviously being relevant from 19-20 season onwards. When we talk about the archiving process, I think it's important to reiterate here, as we've sort of been discussing in the chat, is that those records that don't contain any relevant historical information will be deleted from the archive database, but we would like to retain some of those records for a period of time in conjunction with our data retention policy so that we could report on particular numbers that, say, had a coaching qualification in 2015, for example. So if an individual doesn't meet this criteria, they don't have an active membership, they've never logged into their own profile, then we would look to archive that. And as I said, the RFU would retain a record for a period of time if they ever had a qualification. If a member's been archived and rejoined, any email address that was used previously would then obviously not be sort of counted towards the way that they would log in or create an account in the future, so there wouldn't be a risk of duplication there and any prevention on creating a record with a duplicate email address. Can a club access someone's record if it has been archived? We're working through what those reports actually look like at the moment. The original intention is that record wouldn't be accessible by the club, but we're looking at how we would then showcase those records that have been archived in case there was certain processes that the club wanted to look back on and then have access to. So that's something that we're working through at the moment.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. I think sort of hopefully that's an answer to John up at Billingham. I know you asked a number of questions around the active members with a club reviewing the membership, so hopefully that responds to those. The sort of final one there is a member who rejoins and they've previously been archived. Would their email address prevent them from doing so? The key message for that is no, and reiterating what Matt said, that's the key driver for us doing this, is to make that user journey much more user-friendly. In the past, the answer would have been yes, it probably would. That's now been amended, and we want to get rid of those records to stop that. And a good example of that, linked to that coaching qualification in the middle, is a player who's registered to play first team. They don't know they exist on GMS. 10 years later, they want to become a junior coach or a senior coach, register for a course and log on to the training portal to register for a course, and they didn't know they existed, so they're not able to do it, and they then get a bad and a poor user experience to try and set up a new account, reactivate their account. This process will stop that happening and allow them to log straight in as a new user. or if their email address is right and correct, to just reset their email address as they would with any other reset process. So the key aim of that with this is to address that and improve that user journey. So moving on to sort of the other area, and this is an area we got a lot of questions around, and I think it sort of highlights the interaction that everybody in terms of clubs are having with the age grade process and have had with it over the last 3 years. So there's been some brilliant questions coming around here, but also a clear understanding from everybody of how that age grade process is working. And what we want to do is replicate that and build on the successes of that and the things which have changed over the last 3 years to improve that. So we had a number of questions around date of birth and parental links. I'm going to hand over to Matt just to talk through the sort of links this has to age grade and the parental link process, having been heavily involved in that, and cover a lot of these. There's 6 questions there, but a lot of them cover each other. So I'll let Matt just talk through these, and it'll cover those 6 questions as a whole.
Yeah, so thanks, Alex. So again, a key thing here is that we don't want to disrupt clubs managing their processes for ahead of the start of the new season. What we're really trying to do is tidy up that information so that we create more seamless processes and reduce that administrative burden when trying to tidy up records that potentially either don't exist at the club anymore or are completely out of date, where information isn't relevant. So what we're trying to do is make sure that then an individual, as I said, could go and log into that record. We fully appreciate that there are parental records linked to age grade records that require retainment. So if an age grade record isn't going to be removed, then we won't just remove the parent, and we'll retain that link, but we encourage clubs to have a look at that information and obviously communicate with parents where required, so that they could effectively go and log in and retrieve that information. Just having a look at the questions here. The parental link, obviously we want to make sure that those records are up to date and relevant for the benefits of yourselves at clubs, but also those parents to go and be able to log into their record and obviously manage their children. We've got the 2 emergency contacts question there, which is obviously a good one. So we'd be retaining that primary record against the child where that parental link exists, but there is a process whereby an emergency contact could be added via the player affiliation or registration process, and that doesn't create a hard record for that parent. So what could happen there is that one parent actually exists with a formal record where they log in and manage the child's information, and an additional parent could be added onto that emergency contact form so that clubs have that information on where they can contact those parents should they need to. The principle behind this minimum standard really is to make sure that we have enough information about that individual so that it's legitimate that we hold that information. Some of those GDPR principles that we will touch on in more detail shortly highlight that we actually need to make sure that that's accurate information, up to date, and is complete. So that's the reason why we've put that around a minimum data standard, so that those records are usable moving forward. Can see that the bulk of the inaccurate records are a parental link there. So obviously, if that age grade record and the parental record there are not meeting the minimum standards at all, then we'd be looking to remove that, and obviously encouraging individuals to go through that account creation process, which is more seamless than going to recover an account against information that doesn't exist in the database. Alex, is there anything else that needs to be covered there? So what happens if a member... I'm just going to touch on one that I can see there. What happens if a member refuses to provide that data? There's some industry standard in pieces of information that are being requested here, and it's within the RFU's jurisdiction to be able to set those standards and create them. So what we're looking for there is information that meets that minimum criteria so that we can uniquely identify those records. So I think that needs to be explained to then club members that are held on the RFU's database.
Brilliant, thanks Matt, and hopefully, so we had quite a lot of questions in, but certainly Richard Johnson and Kevin Price asked some questions around age grades, so hopefully that's covered off some of your questions, and if there's sort of further follow-up ones, then as I say, please do use the chat. And then sort of moving on to the other sort of area that's we've had sort of quite a few questions. They've been sort of populated into three there, but there's a number of questions came in around this. So the email verification process. So in a second, I'll let Matt sort of come in and just talk through some of the issues around the non-email delivery, which some questions asked around. Member isn't verifying the record, but they know they're a paid member. That links back to the same as Matt just talked through around if a member's refusing to do that. If the system's right and the information's in there, we do need individuals to start to verify it. We hope this isn't different to what other people are doing in terms of verification of accounts in other areas of their life. So it's trying to bring this in line with that again to take that sort of burden and process away from having to be done by the club administrator and volunteers. And in terms of the email verification, somebody sort of highlighted it is critical, but to give the functionality in there to issue bulk emails. And again, I'll let Matt talk through that along with the non-delivery issue. So would you, Matt?
Yeah, so thanks, Alex. So the email verification, obviously we want to ensure that email is actually attached to a real email account that somebody could then go and access. And we've spoken around how an individual may then go and recover their account. Some issues with email non-delivery, obviously we need to understand some of the specifics there in terms of examples, but we've put some processes in place with the third-party provider of GMS to increase the email monitoring that will take place on GMS so that we can pick up on any issues that have been highlighted there. So we've obviously been aware of email verification issues in terms of some email providers not having received those in the past. We've done some work on that and provided feedback via the help portal. So please do check out the latest links that we've provided on the help portal there. If email verification is critical, give admins a facility to bulk reissue the email. So at any point, clubs can send an email to all individuals that have an email address on their club. That individual could then go and log in to GMS and then obviously verify their email and check that their details are correct from their GMS profile.
Brilliant, thanks Matt, that's brilliant. And I think key bit with that, we've started to sort of highlight that these help articles, support resources are available on the GMS help desk, and that's a really good example of one that can be looked at and supported with that bulk emailing process. So sort of final theme that we sort of came out in terms of the previously questions is GDPR. But just before I do that, if you haven't already asked a question and we've covered some of the areas and it doesn't relate to GDPR, then please start typing your questions in if you've not already done so. And Ian will start to pull some of those out for the next section of the session. But before we do that, we'll touch on the GDPR area. There's been a number of questions come in, especially around sort of non-players and what the impact is on there, but also around some of the GDPR sort of legislation, some of the actual requests as to why we're doing this and is it legitimate. So I will hand over to Matt just to talk us through this bit before we come across to Ian for some questions from the floor.
Yeah, so there's quite a few sort of GDPR related questions here, and there's some fundamental principles that we're very conscious of, and that we've got some relevant processes whereby we collect and process that information. Ultimately, we're not joint controllers of the data, but we're both controllers of the data when we talk about RFU administrators and then obviously the clubs themselves. So we are the ultimate decision makers in terms of the fields that exist in GMS. So we both have separate responsibilities, both as the NGB and then as club administrators. So clubs are ultimate users of GMS and then also process information in that space. So as I said, the decision in terms of the data that's captured in GMS is ultimately the RFU's responsibility, and then we stand behind the reasons and the principles why we collect and process that information. So we've spoken around some of the, and there's been some questions around why do we have specific fields of data that are captured? It's probably twofold really. So one is how do we uniquely identify a record across the database? So if an individual doesn't want to provide a certain piece of information, there's a legitimate purpose there for us to be able to do that, rather than just say having a first name and an email address. And a first name and last name and an email address, for instance, we need a minimum set of data to be able to uniquely identify those records across the database, and also capture them for the purposes of the business rules that then underpin processes inside of GMS. So if you think about certain things such as from an administrative perspective, processing a DBS, or from a playing perspective, the allocation into teams, we look at sort of what those minimum requirements are in terms of the data that's held, and then apply that to some of the principles around how we manage that data across the system and how some of those business rules are enacted. So we've got a legal team here at the RFU, and we work quite closely with them. We've got the privacy policy, the GMS terms of use, and then the RFU's GMS privacy policy, all that highlight why we capture and manage the data that we do. And then we also speak to our legal team on a regular basis around what and how we capture that information, and moving forward what our options are. One area that we're investigating at the moment is the mandatory requirement on gender when we don't have a playing role against that individual. And one of the reasons there that we need to look at that is, obviously from a playing perspective, you provide that information to then be allocated to an appropriate team, but that will then require a separate process in terms of how we capture that at the playing aspect. So refining some of those user journeys is required, and we're looking at that at the moment, again, sort of working with the legal team in that aspect. We've obviously then got an appropriate measure in terms of how we look at data minimization. So we've looked at how we actually, the number of records that are retained on the system, and then making sure that those records are accurate. So in order to house those records, we feel that there needs to be of a minimum criteria and standard in order for them to exist. And we also want to support clubs in actually being able to maintain records that are active and relevant on an annual basis or a biannual basis. So that's the reason why we've put some of these processes in place, and then how we're managing that. So if any clubs do have specific questions in terms of, from a GDPR perspective, the reasons in terms of why we capture certain elements of data, please take a look at the privacy policies, the terms of use, and then we can also mop up any questions either via the GMS help portal or via the specific legal@rfu.com email address, and we'll be happy to then touch base with you in terms of why that data is captured and the legitimacy behind that.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt, and thanks to sort of Richard Johnson, Neil Whittington, who came in with some questions around that area, and sort of complex area, but one that's really important. So hopefully that's covered off some of those. So that's sort of the themes that we've identified from the pre-received questions. We've got sort of plenty of time left for live questions. So what we're going to do now is, as we've been going through there and you've been typing your questions in, Ian's been looking at some of those, and Ian's going to come in and just ask those questions to Matt or I to allow us to start to respond to those. And just to stress again, with the time we've got, we'll get through as many as we can, but any we can't get through, we'll take a log of all the chat bar, and we'll be able to come back to people with any responses required. And it is a live process, so if there's things in there which we can update on the Club Support Centre questions or in the JMS help portal, we will do so as well. So I'll hand over to Ian.
No worries. Yeah, there's been a lot of questions, so I've pulled out some, but please feel free to pop them in the chat if there is any more. One of a common one, which lots of people are asking, is just why the urgency? Can we have an extension around the time? Why can't we not have until the end of the year? And then sort of lots of people saying sort of wrong time of year. We've just come off the back of a incredibly tough year, and we're about to go into the season and wanting to get players back playing rugby again. So yeah, why the urgency now? Why the deadline of 23rd of July?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question from everyone, and probably apologies if that really hasn't come out yet. There's certainly more communication that's following, and obviously we're fully recognise that the timing is sort of a question that we need to answer. So effectively, what we're looking at is a player affiliation process across a number of constituent bodies ahead of 21-22 season, and we're working through that process at the moment. What we're extremely conscious of is presenting a very poor user experience to individuals that try and recover their account, where their information does not exist or is of a poor standard or is incomplete. And what we want to be able to do is provide that seamless user experience when going through an account creation process, and then reducing club administrator burden and trying to tidy up records that either do not exist or where that information is not relevant against an individual profile. So where we've looked at really trying to then retain some of those records linked to things like electronic match card, where a course has been booked by an individual in the last few years, all of those kind of things is why we're looking to retain those individuals on the platform, and obviously then work with clubs to make sure that's then accurate moving forward. So really trying to put the data in the hands of the individual where their record exists on a platform, and we want to provide a better user experience for those individuals, so that obviously that account creation process and then any account recovery process moving forward is far more seamless. So that's part of that reasoning around the timing as to why we're doing this. Alex, is there anything else to add on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think you've covered the key items there, and I suppose it's just to stress this is part, as we said, this is part of a long-term process to try and improve it overall. So to really reduce that workload on everybody involved and get the individuals to take that responsibility. And also we're conscious from the feedback that the figure does look daunting in some cases when you look at the number of inaccurate records, but when you take out now those bits which won't be archived, and especially the parental link ones, the actual number of users in there, especially those that have been more than 3 years old, because since those more recent will meet those standards. In some cases, some people have been in there a long time and haven't been at the club for a long time. So it's an opportunity to clear that out and start afresh in terms of really being really accurate with what we're trying to do, and support some of the processes which will come to help you in the long run as well. So especially around that player affiliation, and also around sort of insurance and player welfare and those areas that we need to be improving to support you. So that allows us to do that. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, no worries. There is loads coming in. Can you supply templates we can use to mail to those records with missing data? So a common template to be used by all, that would ensure all the key messages get across correctly. And the second part of that was, and emphasize it as a requirement of the RFU and not the club.
Yeah, so I think what we're really aiming to do there, Ian, is assist clubs where we can, and we appreciate that there's compromises here, and that we need to make sure that this process works, right? So we can absolutely look to provide a template out to clubs. I guess one of the whole reasons why we're doing this process is that we can see that there's over 1 million records in GMS that can't be contacted because they don't have an email address. So whilst we absolutely can assist there, I just want to make sure that's sort of understood, that we've obviously got a lot of records there that just simply couldn't log in to GMS, and that's a problem, but also couldn't be contacted as well.
Yeah, and another quite common one earlier on in the session was just around GMS emails not arriving, and still, I think that came in from Nick saying GMS emails do not arrive. The member doesn't receive it, not even in their junk.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that can be checked there. So you can obviously look at the individual communication history and check that email was actually sent. Obviously, we've already mentioned that we're focusing on increasing that monitoring with FSI, the third party providers of GMS, and we've also included some additional help portal guidance on what those how those emails you can increase the capability of that email actually arriving at its destination with things like settings on allowing particular emails to come through to a personal inbox.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Matt. And right at the start of the question, lots of people were asking around what is the user groups that you've referred to. So Alex, which people were asking, you know, how were they consulted, etc. If you're able to answer that. I think that came from Dan Toby was one of the people who answered. Asked that.
Yeah, don't want to pick that up. So yeah, in terms of the age grade process, there were user groups developed to test that process as we went through, and they'll be established to test the player affiliation process as the pilot continues. In terms of the data tidy up process, that's been feedback from clubs, so no formal user groups. It's been more the discussion with clubs, getting feedback from clubs as how that's helped shape this. But user groups will certainly be a key part of the pilots as we start to develop that user journey and improve that from a player interaction side of things and from a club interaction side of things once players are taking more responsibility for their records. Nice one, cheers Alex. And then another really common one that was coming up was people saying what's to stop us as clubs putting in a rogue date of birth or email just so the GMS record is filled.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think that we'd hope that there's a different attitude and opinion to that across the board. If you look at some of those principles in terms of ensuring that an individual actually knows they have a record on GMS, the fact that there's accurate data that's assigned to that individual, there are some responsibilities there, both from the RFU's perspective, but also the clubs to actually ensure that a record is existing on GMS in an appropriate format. One of the key reasons as well that we want to be able to do this is to be able to communicate with individuals to let them know that their record does exist on this database and that they could go and log in and manage their own information. And we can also then in the future advise them of why and when their records would be archived if there's absolutely no activity whatsoever. And there's some of the key reasons why we think that's important that those points are answered. Yeah, just to add to that as well, I think the other important bit, linking back at the start around, do we need to communicate more with wider groups, so players and coaches and things. To be able to do that, we need that email address in there. We need the data accurate, and that's not just RFU. It might be the constituent body or the club. We know clubs are very good at internally communicating, but there may be other ways you could look to do that. But from an RFU perspective and wider group, without those contacts being sort of right, we aren't able to do that. So it then relies on the club administrators, the club team managers, or the coaches to register and get those new members on there fully. So is to try and ultimately aim to reduce that and get individuals to take responsibility for their own information, their own data, and that would then support course bookings and playing as it does in other sports already.
And that's kind of like the themes that I've picked out, Alex. So there's time for live questions now. Do you want to get a couple more live questions to come in?
Brilliant. Yeah, if there's any other ones that have come out from there that you want to sort of pick out, that'd be great. Looking at the time, so yeah, we've got another sort of 4 or 5 minutes we could look at for live questions before we sort of cover the last few slides.
A fair number of people still asking things such as, why do we need that information? Why do we hold that? Do you want to explain around the archive records?
Yeah, so I think what we're really stipulating here is that there's obviously we'd like to have the ability to look at particular periods of activity in years gone by, but we also want to make sure that we retain accurate and up-to-date information collectively with the clubs so that GMS becomes a usable platform for its intended purposes, right? So we obviously want to make sure that we go through those processes to ensure that it's the most accurate picture that we can collectively get of the game, both for a club's benefit, for the CB's benefit, and for the RFU's benefit as well. So we really want to make sure that we're completing this task as a sort of first step in the process to then having a manageable process that can be utilised moving forward. We understand at the moment that for a player to log in there isn't today a large benefit to them to be able to do that, other than say paying a membership or completing a task at the beginning of the season. What we're working on is making sure that we have processes there that actually make this an engaging process for a player to have a record for life in rugby. And that means if they've been on an electronic match card, they can track their participation and performance, but also then when those individuals then try to actually go through a process of completing something else in the game, i.e. as a volunteer or potentially to attend a course, that they have a process and a record that they can then manage and understand what that actually looks like as a rugby profile. And we want to make sure that we keep that in an area where those individuals can access. And then the club obviously then should have a reduction in their administrative processes by the fact that those individuals are managing their profiles and then updating the clubs with the relevant information on a seasonal basis. So what we'll do is there's some further information coming out in a couple of days around the RFU's processes for player affiliation moving forward, and obviously this is sort of one of the first steps to make sure that we tidy up some of those records so that we remove some of those barriers to usage. And as we can see from some of the comments there's clearly a lot of legacy data that's caused some of these issues. So yeah, that'd be the answer from my perspective. Alex, is there anything else from your perspective?
I think you've covered the key, but I think the most important message there is what you said at the end around this is the process to try and clear up a lot of those legacy issues, a lot of those historic issues that we've had, and they're the people that have been in the system a long time. The more recent ones are accurate and are working well. So this is the drive to try and improve that and improve everybody's user journey and experience with it. So Ian, just looking like we've got time for probably one more question if there's one there before we sort of cover the last few bits.
Yeah, I suppose it's just there's been a couple of things around why do you need the date of birth and gender for a parent? What purpose do you intend to retain that information? Is it just to sell details for marketing purposes? That's the question that's come in.
Absolutely not. As I touched on, we've set a criteria there where we capture that information to uniquely identify records, and then for the processes of managing individuals in GMS to meet the business rules and some of those processes that underpin GMS functionality. And again, there's some ranges there in terms of what does that look like from a DBS processing perspective? What does it look like from a team allocation perspective? And so on and so forth. So they're the sort of two primary probably examples that we'd use there, but our documentation there exists on our policies, and we're happy to then field any further questions via the help portal or the legal helpline in terms of legal@rfu.com in terms of what that data looks like and why we capture that.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. I think the important thing there, we're trying to keep that process consistent and try and support that throughout. And there have been those rules put in place to make sure that those active members or those people that have paid on the match card aren't archived in this process in this window that we're working in now. So brilliant, thank you very much. I'm just going to sort of move on to the final few slides just to cover off a couple of bits there. I know it's always by, and I'm sure there's lots of other questions. As I say, we will work through that question sheet that's come in and try and make sure that we look at whether anything's been missed off the FAQs we have on the Club Support Centre or any of our help guidance to see if there's other things we need to update. And I think there's a sort of acknowledgement and a massive thank you to those that have input in this so far over the last few months while this has been developed. That's helped develop what's live now, and we've got a sort of hopefully a quick and agile process that will allow us to review this and make any further updates this week. So just in terms of the sort of support that's there, I'm just going to hand over to Ian just to do a poll very quickly, and this is sort of acknowledging some of the wider questions that came in, and also the sort of acknowledging that we're on ongoing reviewing and trying to look at how we can improve and support clubs. So I'll hand over to Ian.
Okay, so the last poll of the evening: what do clubs need to better support your use of GMS? So are you happy with what is available? Do you need online training modules, written help guides, club forums and Q&As like this? So maybe some something nationally, maybe something more local to your area, and then sort of face-to-face sessions as well. Get those votes coming in. Appreciate you might have to think. It's multiple choice, so you can pick a number of things, whatever you prefer. And just to reiterate, we will be looking through the questions that we haven't been able to answer and either update our FAQs, and we will send that out post-event, and that the recording of this webinar will be available on our RFU Club Support YouTube, which we'll email out once it's online, probably by tomorrow, and it will also go on englandrugby.com. I'm going to end the polling now, guys, and share the results. And you can see
Brilliant.
there.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks for that, guys.
So yeah, so just a poll sort of finish off with where we're trying to look at, and it is linked to this, but it's also linked to work we're doing across a sort of wider group to try and sort of work with clubs to improve what we're offering and where we may be able to develop that a bit further. So to say thank you for that. And that sort of links into some of the questions we had in, and we sort of stressed at the start, this is very much around the data tidy process, but a lot of the questions we also got were around wider elements of GMS, and we are keen to try and support that. So there were some questions coming in from a number of people around that, and we want to try and work with clubs. So we will be in touch with some of you. I know some of you have already input already, whether it be through the age grade process or through the development of this data tidy process and support mechanisms. So we'll continue to do that. And one of the areas that was identified through one of the questions that came in was around support for data officers. So that last poll was just to start to support some of the stuff we're thinking of around there. So we did want to acknowledge that. As I said, the time didn't allow us to work through that in specifically around that, but it's something we are looking at. So in terms of help needed, as Matt said, the GMS help portal's there. We have the FAQs in a number of areas, including the data tidy up process on the Club Support Centre on the England Rugby website. And from the session tonight, if there's questions we need to follow up on that we've not been able to respond to, we will review that, and we will come back to you on those items. But please do feel free to raise a ticket through the portal there, and we will come back to you to cover that. So the more we can understand what some of the challenges are through that, the more we can identify the appropriate support. And then just to recap, firstly, thank you much for everybody for attending tonight. We know we've covered a lot, and there's been some great questions that have come in from a number of you, which have helped shape tonight. But as a reminder, individuals that have been active members since August 2019, so the 2019 season, players that have appeared on electronic match card at any point, and individuals with an active DBS will not be archived. So even if they don't meet those minimum standards, we need to acknowledge that they're important, they're active members, and it will impact on the playing of the game this season. So we would encourage you to try and get those up to date, especially as we start to try and interact and communicate more with people, certainly the player side of things. If they want to see the stats, they want to start to interact and improve that player experience, then having an up-to-date record is really key. And also it's just important to highlight this isn't something new. Those records that have been created in the last 3 seasons will already meet this minimum standard. So a lot of those ones that are on there will have either been historically on there, or as we've highlighted tonight, maybe some of the non-playing members or parents that have come in. But again, if they've been added in the last 3 years, they will meet these requirements. So some of these records could have been in the system for a long time, and hopefully it will help us remove that number that have never logged in. So next steps, just a reminder, the window closed on the 23rd of July. So review your invalid or incomplete lists, decide if you want to update them or leave them, but please do ask for help. As we've identified there, the GMS help desk, the club support portal are there to help, and through the network of club developers and our team, if we need to follow up individually, we can do that, and start to develop that. So just to wrap up, for those still with us, just conscious of time, just like to just finish with that same poll and just see if hopefully some of the ones that answered no may have improved. But I'll hand over to Ian. It just allows us to monitor what we've done tonight and see if we need to make any changes.
sorry guys, if you could just pop in the chat, the poll won't launch.
No problem. No problem.
Cheers, Alex. Good way to end there. Sorry guys. Sorry.
Yeah, just pop that in the chat then if you've got any sort of feedback around whether you understand the process. If you've still got concerns as well, pop that in there. Always good to finish with a technical issue right at the end. That's probably perfect timing. So again, please feel free to pop anything else in the chat, any feedback on there. And just to recap, hopefully we have given you an overview of why we're doing it. We've answered as many questions as we can get through in that hour, and sort of agreed any future support requirements through the chat function or through the feedback there. So just a final thing from myself, Ian, Matt and Chloe, just a big thank you. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Hopefully the sun is shining where you are and you'll be able to enjoy that. And please do come back to us. Please give us feedback and we will get the notes out to this and the recording of the slides by the end of the week. Thanks, everyone.